everybody. My name is Jason Reynolds. I am the current National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, coming to you from my home in Washington, D.C. I'm currently in my office where I do all my work. As you can see, all the books behind me. I'm also the author of Stamped Racism, Antiracism and You. And actually, I should say I'm the co-author of the book. It came about because there is a wonderful race scholar named Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He's America's foremost race scholar in this moment. And he published a book in 2016 called Stamped from the Beginning, which is a history of racist ideas and policies. And he won the National Book Award. We met at the National Book Award, and it was there that it was shortly after that, rather, that he asked me to somehow translate all this work. I mean, it was 600 pages of scholarship about the history of race in America from the 1400s all the way up to current day. And he wanted to figure out a way for that book to be translated into something for younger people, or for people who may not be scholars or who don't have the capacity to read a 600-page tome, a brilliant tome, but a tome nonetheless. And so after some prodding, I eventually said yes and decided to tackle it. And the purpose behind it is to make sure that this information is as accessible as possible so that we can sort of arm ourselves with information, create new vocabulary, and hopefully begin to actually push the line and move the needle as it pertains to the conversation around race in America. I think creativity comes into play when it comes to the retelling of a thing or the telling of it in general, because I think we live in a world where young people are hyperstimulated. And that's not necessarily a new thing anymore. There's the internet, there's social media, there's video games and YouTube, there's all sorts of things to, I won't say distract, but to engage young people. And so as a writer, we have to figure out how to not fight against those things, because we're going to lose that fight. Our job is to work with those things and to meet them where they are and to create hyperstimulation even within the pages of a book. So in order to do so, the first thing you have to do is you have to figure out how to tap into the psyche of young people. And the best way to tap into their psyche is to tap into their language. I think it's the way that we say things that determine how we engage with the kids around us. The way that we say things will create the tether that brings about the trust that they have for the person who's speaking, especially if that person is an adult, and most especially if that person is talking about something that they normally would not be interested in. I was not a child who was interested in history, especially reading a history book, especially if that book reminded me anything of school or textbooks or class. And so my job was to subvert all of those expectations, to let them know that this not only can be cool, but it can be written in a way that feels familiar and conversational, and still also have an extraordinary bearing upon your life, in terms of just making sure that you have the information necessary to make this world a better place, like so many young people actually want to do anyway. History has to be spoken about as conversation, because ultimately that's what it is, right? Like conversation is the volleying of back and forth of ideas. Right? We pose an idea, and then you and I go back and forth, sort of fleshing out what that idea is, talking about whether or not we agree or disagree, or adding on to that idea, right? And I think history should be looked at the same way, because it's an ever-evolving thing. Now, the things that have happened, right? But the danger in thinking of history as only the things that have happened is to put history and the things of the past in a vacuum, which then connotes that they have absolutely no connection to the lives that we live today. And the truth is, our present time is in conversation with the past. Our present time is also in conversation with the future. As a matter of fact, the past is in conversation with the future, right? And so there's this constant sort of interplay between where we are today, where we're going, and where we've been, and the volleying of ideas and the evolution of those ideas back and forth that's basically our lives in a nutshell. If we're doing it right, if we're living examined lives, which is what I'm also and what we're also encouraging. I think history living in a bubble is dangerous, because what it allows us to believe is that there's no more work to be done. It allows us to believe that what has happened in the past has stayed in the past, but we all know that that's not true, especially those of us who are living any sort of marginalized lives in this country. And so I think for me, I want to bust the bubble that history apparently lives in, and say, no, it's not that history lives in this bubble. History is perennial, right? Think of history as an ongoing train, and at any given time, we are on that train in different cars. But instead of it being like, we're on different trains and history is one train and the present is a separate train and the future is another train. Instead, we're all on the same train, just in different cars, right? History might be in a car behind us, and we might be in this car, and maybe there's something in the car ahead of us, but it's still one singular train. And if any part of that train goes down, all the train goes down. So it's best we examine every single part of the train to make sure the train keeps moving forward, so that we can then determine what's the best way to get to whatever destination that we're trying to get to. But to pretend like the back of the train doesn't exist is dangerous if we actually want the train to function, right? So we have to acknowledge the engine, we have to acknowledge the caboose, we have to acknowledge every part of that train, even if there are parts of the train that get a little mucky and a little clunky and a little ugly and a little oily. It's still the train that we are on. And that's the way that I look at this conversation. From the very beginning of the book, I really was fascinated by Gomez Eyanes de Zurara. Now, this is a man whose name we do not hear. I had never heard before starting to work on this book. And he was a Portuguese scribe. He was the man who was responsible for telling the story of how the Portuguese went into North Africa, enslaved the North Africans, and told the story of how what made them different than the other European countries who were enslaving people. What made them different was that they were doing it for salvific reasons. They were doing it to give the Moorish people Christianity and to save their souls and to civilize them, and all of this sort of narrative that ended up becoming the main narrative for the enslavement of Africans that came to America, or to the Americas rather. And I was fascinated by this person, not because he was a part of the actual slave trading, because he technically wasn't. He technically wasn't he wasn't like boots on the ground, right? But what he was the man who wrote the story and spun the story and proliferated that narrative to other parts of Europe, which then eventually would become the narrative that would, justify enslavement of millions of African people in North America. And the reason why I find it fascinating is because I work in literature, I work in media, I tell stories. And so I recognize the power of media, the power of literature, the power of language, the power of story, and how that story that he told set forth one of the most tragic and complicated systems that the world has ever seen. And so what exactly is my role as a storyteller? And furthermore, what exactly is the power of the storyteller going forward? So he was definitely one of them. I also was fascinated by Thomas Jefferson. I mean, we all know the story of Thomas Jefferson, or at least we know bits of it, but to look at Thomas Jefferson as a man who was full of contradiction, a man who went back and forth between knowing that slavery was wrong, but not being willing to stand on his ethic because of his need for money, and understanding that slavery was capitalist and an economic advantage. Right? It's a complicated thing. And to see him sort of teeter back and forth his entire life between doing the right thing and living the wrong thing, between knowing slavery was wrong, but owning slaves, he represents what I think a lot of us feel, right? A lot of people, a lot of human beings, not necessarily in the sense of the ownership of humans, right? Of course, not that, but in the sense of grappling with one's morality up against the realities of a country's sort of economic system. All of us have been in a situation where it's like, do I do the thing that is right, or do I do the thing that is prosperous? And can there be prosperity without ethics? And if so, how dangerous is that? And to see him sort of do this dance is just, to me, was a fascinating thing. And then lastly, what I'll say is all the Black women in the book, whether it be Ida B. Wells, whether it be Zora Neale Hurston, whether it be, of course, the great Angela Davis. I think there's something about the history of Black women in America that has gone unsung, that has been the victim of an extraordinary erasure. But I don't know if there's a more anti-racist group historically in this country than Black women, and I think it's time that they get their due. To be quite frank, if there's no hope, what exactly is the point of doing any of this work? the reason that we're all working so hard is because we believe that just maybe there is a chance that things can change. You know, I spoke to the great writer James McBride recently, and he was quoting a writer and a famous journalist, Pete Hamill, Brooklyn journalist Pete Hamill. And he said, you know, Hamill always said, skepticism is healthy, but cynicism is a very dangerous thing. And you know, when he said that to me, it struck me because I think he's right. I'm skeptical. Don't get me wrong. I'm skeptical for good reason. Right. My life, my family's lives, the lives of my friends, I've earned the right to be a bit skeptical, but I'm not cynical. I'm not a cynic. I do believe that we can do better and that we will do better and that we can change. Furthermore, I'm around children all the time. And when you're around young people like me, it sort of eliminates the possibility of cynicism, because young people remind you every single day that they actually want the world to be a better place, right? Like in the midst of them being adolescent, in the midst of all their teenage shenanigans, at the core of who they are is a generation of people fighting for equity. They want the world to be fair, right? Almost to a fault. But it's that naivete up against the irreverence of youth that actually might make something happen, right? If they don't have the same scars that I have or that a lot of us have when you get past a certain age. They still believe that the world can be good. They still believe that human beings can change and that we can see each other as each other and not as separate things. And there's something about them, the young people, this new generation, this new crop coming up that energizes me. That sort of swells me with a certain kind of pride and excitement. And I will do everything I can to fight on their behalf, to shut down all the naysayers who talk terribly about them, and to stand beside them, not in front of them, to stand beside them, to help to guide them along their way, and maybe even stand behind them to give a little nudge when they feel a bit discouraged. And that's it. I talked to my mother the other day, and she's 75 years old. My mother was at the March on Washington all those years ago and was a part of that movement. And to hear my 75-year-old mother say, you know, I won't say a bad word about these kids. I'm proud of them for being in the street. I'm proud of them for raising their voices. I'm proud of them for screaming and shouting and making a mess of things. Get in the way, young people, right? That is the only way to change, is for you to get in the way, right? And I think if we were to look at history, it's always the young people. This is in tradition of for all human revolutions, right? And when I say revolution, everybody gets all scared and worried and things of that nature. But it just means drastic change. It means that it's time to take a hard left. And I think all change has always come from young people who don't have to worry about the hangups of jobs and families and mortgages and this, that, and the third. They're like, look, I'm young, I'm irreverent, I'm ready to shake the table, and I have the stamina that a 40-year-old just doesn't have anymore. And there's something about that is wonderful. Now, here's the thing that I think about more than anything, is that we have to make sure that, and they have to make sure, and we have to make sure that we help to guide and mold them a certain way, because the internet, as powerful of a tool as it is, and it is a powerful tool, they have used it expertly. But the internet will convince you, and I always say this, the internet will convince you that half love is whole love. And what I mean is, it will convince you that action is pushing a few buttons or making an interesting statement, taking a few pictures. And I'm not saying that those things are inaction. I'm just saying that that's not whole action. And I think what I want young people to continue to do, because they're doing it, I want them to continue to do, is to make their presence known physically, right? Make it clear, show up and put their bodies in the street, put their bodies in. Now, this is a dangerous thing to say, right? Because the issue with this is, well, how do we do this safely? How do we make sure? Well, I think that there are those of us like myself who have to show up with them, who have to make sure that they have understand the necessary tools and the history of protest, make sure that they pack the necessary things. This is very real, practical things. It isn't all just being led by emotion. I'm talking about practical things that I want young people who want to make their voices heard, like never go alone, be safe. These are all the complicated conversations and the very sort of banal conversations that we need to be having with young people who are in the midst of protest, a necessary protest. I want to make sure that they're not just led led by adolescent emotion, and innocent and honest and raw emotion, but also being led from a place of logic and a place of thought, critical thought and analysis. And they are not too young to have all those things. They contain multitudes, and I believe that. So we just have to make sure that we're filling them up with the information and the tools so that they go out there and know how to handle themselves. The most creative thing, the most brilliant thing that America ever made was America. That was sort of the fever pitch of creativity, was the making of the country. And what I'm hoping now is that we're on the precipice of another brilliant innovation. And that innovation is going to basically be the reformation of a lot of our systems, the acknowledgement of a lot of our harms and wounds. Right? This is a very different kind of ingenuity. It's an ingenuity that takes the same kind of courage and fortitude and moxie that it took for America to be made in the first place, despite how complicated the making of the country was. Now we're at a place where it's like, well, how do we remake the country, right? How do we improve on the model? And I think people are a little nervous about it, but I think a lot of us are like, it's time for the 400-year experiment to be edited, to be updated, right? The first draft got us here. And now it's time for a rewrite. It's time for a recast. And that's going to be painful. Like anybody who writes novels for a living, you know, to cut out something is a painful thing when you loved that part of the story. You loved the language you were able to come up with. You loved the moment of genius you thought you had in that moment. But then you look at it years later and you realize it doesn't hold up. And now it's got to be stricken from the text. And it's complicated and painful, but it's necessary to make the story the best version of itself, right? And I think when I think of American ingenuity, I'm thinking now it's time for an edit, a bold, red marked edit. And I think that the babies, the kids, are more than ready to insert their parts of this narrative, and to, you know, put some edit marks on the page. History is an interesting thing because the way that we talk about history, learn history, and engage with history is outside of ourselves, outside of our bodies, right? We intellectualize it. Memory is something that exists on the inside of our bodies. It exists, it literally is attached to our psyche. It affects the way that we move around the world on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour basis, right? I can recall my childhood, the teachings of my mother, things of that nature. And those teachings, my mother scolding me at 14 years old, keeps me from doing things that I know are wrong at 36, because it's embedded in my body. It lives in my coding, right? And so when we talk about memory and we talk about sort of a prime example right now, especially with Stamped, is even thinking about language, right? How do we change the conversation around language when it comes to race? Because that language attaches itself to our memories and our psyches and our coding, right? So if we stop thinking about something being not racist and start thinking about how we can be more anti-racist, the simple shift in language changes the way that we move around the world. It changes the way that we engage with people around us. It gives us new lexicon, new language, and with new language comes culture, because language is the cornerstone of culture. We change language, we change culture. That's the way it works, right? If we're being honest about it. Now we can change language and use that language to cheat, right? Language is either going to exclude or include, right? That's the way it works. So we can sort of manipulate language negatively, but what we're asking is that we use this new vocabulary, this new lexicon, to basically build upon a culture and shift it with the shifting of the language. So instead of saying, like, you know, I'm not racist or I don't want to be racist, you work to be anti-racist so that you have to be active, and anti-racism and the actions that you make as a person striving for anti-racism then attaches itself to your memory. Then, you know, moving forward, every time you see something that doesn't feel right, or that goes against what you know to be racist, or or that goes against what you know to be anti-racist, your memory and your psyche will kick itself on, and you will know that this requires an anti-racist action. Right? It's no different than thinking about antibodies when it comes to viruses. I talk about this all the time. The reason that we inject antibodies into the body, which is basically dulled version of the active virus, is because we need your cells, your protective cells in your body, to recognize when the virus has come to activate themselves and attack the virus before it attacks you, right? So what we're saying is, which means, by the way, the body has memory. Your cells will memorize what the antibody, the dulled version of the virus, it will memorize what that virus is, so that when a live version of the virus comes into you, it will say, I recognize that. Let me turn myself on and kill the virus. What we're saying is, what if we would have taken information in the same way? What if we would have changed our language and our dialogues and our conversations and even our actions in the same way, so that the moment that racism enters the body, by the way, it's almost always vaporous. You can't always see it. But the moment that racism enters your space, enters your body, the antibodies of anti-racism attack it, because it remembers what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, what it smells like. It remembers it. It attacks it before it turns you into something that you do not want to be. Something to think about. So memory is very, 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 very important. It's a different way to think about history. It's a way to think about history as something intrinsic, not just as something that exists sort of outside of ourselves. The racism of America is woven into the fibers of the country. And I know we don't like to talk about it. Some of us don't like to talk about it, but racism is woven into the fibers. It's in the genetic code of America. It's woven into our systems, our policies, our laws. It is much bigger than a you and me thing, than a person-to-person thing. It exists on a macro level and a systemic level. That being said, you and me, and you and I still have responsibilities to treat each other as human beings. And in order to do that, one must strive toward anti-racism. Anti-racism is not a place you can get to. It is not a destination. No one will ever actually make it there. The point is to fight for it, to work toward it. Racism will continue to evolve. Therefore, the way that we look at it and study it and fight against it has to evolve with it. The language will continue to change. We will continue to learn. If we're on this process and we're on this journey to learn forever, then the world will be a better place, right? It literally comes down to that. If I can wake up every day and say, I want to be more anti-racist, I want to look at human beings as they are, because they are who they are, and that's it, right? And love them for that. Nothing extra, no tags, no, but they're this, but they come from here, but they speak this language, but they're black, but they're brown, but they're all the things. No. I'm going to give everyone the benefit of the doubt for no other reason than the fact that they are on this plane. They exist. And that means that they deserve a right to life and to freedom and to liberty and to equity, right? All those things. I think if we can do that every single day, then we'll be all right. But we got to make sure we focus on the micro and the macro, right? The micro is you and I, our everyday interactions, but the macro is making sure that we change our governmental systems, that we fight for that, fight to shift the systems and the laws and the policies that have been written as racist from the onset. And the history is what gives us the power to even know that.